I remember the sound of the train brakes first. A low metallic screech as our car slowed down, then came the jolt, the kind that knocks your knees together, even if you're braced for it. We had been traveling west for what felt like days, but time had no shape anymore. Ever since they captured me outside Saint-Lô, I'd stopped counting. All I knew was that we were no longer in Europe. The air smelled different, warmer, dustier, more alive. They opened the boxcar doors just before sunset. The light hit us like artillery flash, sudden, blinding, and unforgiving. Raus, schnell, barked an American guard, not with anger, but with routine. I stepped down, hands still bound, eyes squinting toward a skyline that made no sense. It wasn't a city, nor a camp, not in the sense we Germans understood camps. It was enormous. I thought we'd arrived at a factory. That would have made sense. But then I saw the sign. Quartermaster Depot Number 6, United States Army. The ground was paved in all directions. To the left, steel warehouses stood in long rows, each the size of a Luftwaffe hangar. To the right, a convoy of olive-drab trucks rolled by, like ants in formation, each one marked with numbers, each carrying crates, barrels, clothing, weapons, food, supplies. Endless supplies. A low hum filled the air, not noise, but machinery. Forklifts, engines, generators, refrigeration units. There was no shouting, no chaos, just efficiency, industrial silence, the silence of a machine too large to grasp. We were marched past a row of sheds where soldiers, American ones, were checking clipboards against pallet manifests. There were no commanders here, only logisticians. I noticed something strange. Nobody seemed to be in a rush, and yet everything moved, constantly, like clockwork. I had studied logistics at flight school. I had written reports on fuel usage and spare parts rates for Messerschmitt squadrons. I thought I understood supply, but this wasn't supply. This was something else, something terrifying. The camp officer met us near the entrance to one of the main structures. He wasn't in uniform, civilian clothes, thin spectacles, introduced himself as a logistics supervisor, not military rank. He looked at us like we were inventory. That should have insulted me, but I was too distracted. Behind him, the warehouse doors were open, and inside, I saw an ocean of crates, stacked floor to ceiling, marked with codes, destinations, categories. One crate was labeled spare boots, size 12, cold weather, North Africa theater, Q4. Another, wool blankets, Arctic grade, Aleutian Islands, forward drop. That was the moment it hit me. These supplies weren't just for this camp. They weren't even for this state. They were global. This single depot, one facility in one place, was managing materials for operations thousands of miles apart, and it wasn't improvising. It was planned, down to the sock size. I turned and looked across the facility. The warehouse we were about to enter was only one of at least a dozen. There were rail lines leading directly into the buildings, cranes suspended from ceilings, conveyor belts, cold storage units with dedicated power systems. I had seen the inside of Berlin's central military depot once, before the war. It had been the pride of the Wehrmacht, but it looked like a farmer's shed compared to this. My stomach tightened. I felt something worse than fear, worse than shame. I felt irrelevance. They led us to our assigned quarters inside the depot perimeter. Nothing fancy. Rows of cots, metal lockers, but clean, lit, heated. Outside the barracks window, the forklifts kept moving under floodlights. At one point, I saw a shipment of canned peaches being offloaded. Pallets of them. Probably 1,000 cans just for one troop rotation. That night, lying on a cot that didn't sag, covered by a blanket warmer than anything I'd had on the front, I didn't sleep. Not because I missed home, not because of guilt, but because for the first time, I realized the war was not about who was braver, who had better pilots, or who believed harder. It was about who could outsupply reality itself. And America had already done it. The next morning, they handed me a clipboard. I wasn't expecting that. I had assumed we'd be digging latrines or loading trucks under guard, but instead, they put me on inventory duty. Apparently, they had reviewed my file Logistics Officer, Luftwaffe Eastern Front, 3 campaigns. To them, that made me qualified to count boxes. A civilian foreman walked me through my section. You'll be assigned to Area B, 4 textiles, cold weather gear, footlocker components. We rotate stock every 2 weeks. Every crate has a tracking code. You'll log it, tag it, and verify weight. Pretty simple. He handed me a pencil, not a weapon. Then he left. I stood there for a moment, surrounded by steel shelves rising 4 levels high, each packed with crates so uniform, so precisely stacked, they looked more architectural than logistical. The warehouse itself stretched longer than a Luftwaffe airstrip. My section alone, just B4, was larger than the entire supply compound I'd worked in outside Paris. I started walking the aisles. Every crate was stenciled with codes. Some said Parkas, Arctic, size M. Others read sleeping bags, 3-layer, Pacific Theater. There were boxes just for extra zippers. Pallets of replacement tent stakes. Separate containers for spare buttons. Organized by thread type and climate rating. At first I thought it was waste, overproduction. Why so many layers of redundancy? But then I saw the system. Nothing was excessive, it was preemptive. They weren't reacting to problems. They were preventing them. A soldier wouldn't need to request new boots. Boots were already en route before his pair failed. Later that day, during a lunch break, I was allowed to sit at a table near the depot's logistics office. On the wall hung a map, not of America or Europe, but of the U.S. Army's global supply web. Red lines stretched from New York to Naples, from San Francisco to Saipan. Dozens of depots just like this one, each with its own sphere of responsibility. I stared at the key in the corner. Quartermaster Corps, Theater Distribution Zones, 1,944. There were arrows, flowcharts, shipping ratios. It looked more like a railroad timetable than a military map. That evening, after logging more than 3,200 pounds of winter uniforms, I walked past a loading bay. A train had just pulled in 38 cars, all loaded with nothing but duffel bags, each one tagged and sealed. One of the guards told me they were rotating 15,000 new troops through northern France next week. These are their bags, been packed 2 weeks ahead. I blinked. You packed their luggage before they arrived? He grinned. This is the army, man. We beat them there. I didn't laugh, because in that moment, I remembered a bitter winter near the Dnieper River, 1,942. We had run out of wool socks. Our unit requisitioned replacements through 4 layers of command. It took 12 days. We lost 3 men to frostbite, and now I stood in a building with an entire row labeled socks, thermal, high compression, Q3 reserve. The numbers overwhelmed me. Later, I learned that this single depot could process over 20,000 line items per day. That included clothing, tools, spare parts, food, and medical equipment. The depot operated 24 hours a day, with 3 rotating shifts, and employed over 2,000 workers, most of them civilians. They weren't improvising, they were industrializing war. I began to understand that this was why we were losing. Not on the battlefield, not in the skies over Normandy, but here, in the back rooms, in the ledgers, in the warehouses, with perfect lighting and coffee stations. They weren't winning with tanks or bombers, they were winning with distribution. I thought of Berlin, of the overcrowded rail hubs, the delayed shipments, the field units scrounging for parts. We had engineers who could design the world's fastest aircraft, but we didn't have the freight cars to move their fuel. Our commanders debated tactics. The Americans just delivered. In the days that followed, my job became numb routine. I inventoried crates. I logged stock changes. I watched fork trucks move with metronomic precision. But inside, something kept unraveling. Not from hunger or humiliation, but from clarity, from seeing the truth too plainly to deny it anymore. We were not simply outgunned, we were outnumbered, outplanned, outdelivered. One afternoon I sat on a bench near the depot's motor pool and counted the vehicles parked in neat rows, 216, mostly GMC CCKW trucks, some Jeeps, a few tank transporters. All spotless, all ready. I knew those trucks meant something more than just rubber and engines. They were veins in the bloodstream of an empire that never slept. It was then that I stopped thinking of myself as a soldier. Because soldiers fight. But I had seen the real war, and it wasn't fought with rifles. It was fought with clipboards. By the second week, I stopped keeping track of the days. There was no point. Every shift blurred into the next, each one defined by pallets, labels, check marks, and silence. I moved from textiles to general equipment, then to cold weather gear. Each section revealed new levels of planning that bordered on madness or genius. I no longer knew which. One morning, I was assigned to help a technician inspect non-critical secondary surplus. That was the official term. In practice, it meant walking through a separate building filled with equipment that hadn't even been used yet but had already been replaced. New shovels, new boots, new rations, all boxed and untouched, stacked 6 meters high, row upon row, a kind of graveyard of anticipation. At one point, we passed a fenced-off zone marked Ejected. Inside were crates of canteens, brand new, with only minor imperfections. Some were scratched, others had misaligned print on the cap. The American beside me shrugged. "Cheaper to remake 'em than sort 'em," he said. Cheaper to remake. I stood there, frozen, staring at a literal mountain of metal and plastic that any German unit would have killed to receive. We once boiled water in shell casings. I had seen a corporal make a mess tin out of flattened propeller blade. Here, they threw things away because the font wasn't centered. Later that day, I helped process a delivery of entrenching tools, folding spades, designed for rapid field use. The shipment contained 4,000 units, all pre-oiled, all packaged in pairs. I asked, why the pairs? Each platoon gets extras, backups for backups. The man wasn't bragging. He wasn't even interested. For him, this was just normal. For me, it was tectonic. In Luftwaffe logistics, we planned for minimums. What was the fewest number of belts a gunner needed? Could we stretch wool production by shortening coats? Could rations be cut to preserve stock? That was how we thought. That was how we had to think. Efficiency meant survival. In America, efficiency meant overproduction. Winning by never needing to economize at all. I kept returning to a moment from 1943 winter in France. I'd been tasked with requisitioning new boots for a forward squadron. I filled out the forms, waited 2 weeks. When the crates arrived, half the boots were the wrong size. The other half were mismatched left, right, and right. I still remember the anger on the captain's face. I had failed. But now I walked through an American warehouse where boots were sorted not just by size and model, but by terrain, temperature, humidity tolerance, and ankle support rating. And that wasn't a joke. I saw one crate labeled Boots, Jungle, High Ankle, Monsoon Grade, Batch D. I couldn't look away. Even in the medical wing, the excess was clinical. They had separate storage for bandages, gauze, syringes, quinine, morphine, iodine, sulfa, gloves, each in dozens of variants. The depot supplied not only combat medics, but entire mobile surgical units, each fully stocked weeks before deployment. There were even backup X-ray machines, not parts, entire duplicate machines boxed and waiting. A technician noticed me staring. "You guys didn't do it this way?" he asked, half smiling. I said nothing. What could I say? Number. We did not. In the Luftwaffe, we scraped paint off damaged equipment to use as camouflage. We reboiled morphine to stretch doses. We pulled boots off the dead because the factories couldn't keep up. And here I was, inventorying 3 types of winter sock liners with color-coded stitching for sorting at field hospitals. There was a kind of madness in it. But it was a madness that worked. I learned from a quartermaster supervisor that this depot alone held materials to support 150,000 troops for 6 months without resupply. That included uniforms, weapons, tools, food, medical supplies, repair kits, even recreation kits with books and cards, all of it documented, barcoded, cataloged. The Americans had built a system that not only anticipated attrition, but absorbed it like a sponge. It made sense suddenly why their soldiers looked so different. Not just cleaner, but calmer. They didn't fight wondering when their next resupply would come. They fought knowing it was already moving tracked, logged, and en route before the first bullet was even fired. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Like the label system, every item had a code string, indicating origin, destination, use case, expiration, and priority level. No handwriting, no ambiguity, just printed logic. I saw replacement belts for machine guns marked 50 calories. Belt, Type B, Europe Theater, Auto Refill, Q3, Auto Refill. The belts weren't ordered. They were replaced automatically, based on usage data from previous missions. It was war by algorithm. It started with a draft of cold air. The kind that doesn't come from wind, but from engineered precision. As I followed the American supervisor into the food storage complex, the temperature dropped sharply. He handed me a coat. Not because he was kind, but because this was protocol. Inside, the walls were lined with insulation thicker than tank armor. Refrigerated forklifts moved between aisles at a steady pace. Overhead, the lights cast a bluish hue across the metal floors. The sign above the entrance read, Section D, Perishables, Long Haul Priority. I expected crates of canned meat, hard biscuits, powdered milk perhaps, rations as we understood them. But the moment the first door opened, I saw shelves of fresh eggs. Cartons stacked neatly, labeled Pacific Theater, Guam, Consume by the 15th of November. A refrigerated unit buzzed beside them, full of vacuum-packed chicken breasts, clearly labeled and sorted by weight range. I stared at them, and something inside me broke. These weren't rations. These were choices. These were menus. This wasn't feeding an army. This was provisioning a civilization. The foreman explained the system. They categorized food, not just by type, but by climate durability, delivery time, and digestion speed. Soldiers fighting in jungle heat received different protein-fat ratios than those stationed in northern France. Units operating near saltwater zones were issued corrosion-resistant tins. There were even flavor variations to prevent appetite fatigue. If a soldier won't eat, he won't fight, he said. So we rotate tastes. Rotate tastes? In Stalingrad, we boiled leather. We moved deeper. A row of large containers sat in perfect symmetry, their steel doors hissing slightly as air pressure adjusted. One of them opened and I was hit with a smell so clean, so sterile it made me think of hospitals. Inside were full beef sides hanging from hooks, temperature controlled to the decimal. An American sergeant walked by, checking temperatures on a clipboard, nodding once, moving on. I followed the line of meat and saw pallets of frozen vegetables, then racks of pre-sliced bread, yes, sliced bread, ready to be toasted in field kitchens. All of it marked for units not even on the continent yet. At the far end, I saw something I could not process. A row of steel drums, each marked ice cream mix, vanilla, bulk, Northeast deployment. Ice cream. The Americans were sending ice cream to the front. I turned, looking for someone to confirm what I was seeing. One of the workers, young, glasses, maybe a student in civilian life, noticed my expression. "You'll get used to it," he said, not mockingly, but with routine boredom. "This is just one of 4 cold units on site. We rotate weekly. Next week's shipment includes milkshake concentrate. That was the moment I understood. Not just intellectually, viscerally. We had lost. Not because our soldiers were cowards, not because our generals were fools, but because somewhere, deep inside the machine of war, we had forgotten to plan for comfort, for psychology, for human limits. We expected our men to survive on willpower. They expected theirs to thrive on logistics. A loud hiss pulled my attention back to the room. A loading bay was opening. A new truck had arrived, its trailer full of fresh dairy milk, butter, yogurt. The manifest showed its journey. Kansas to Chicago, to Norfolk, to Liverpool, to Normandy. A 12-day path, all kept below 4 degrees Celsius. That same day, I remembered a friend, Oberleutnant Krauss, who died not from a bullet, but from dysentery. The field kitchens had run out of soap. The resupply never came. He was buried in a frozen ditch with 18 others. No ceremony. No grave marker. I wondered what he would have thought if he'd seen this truck. This milk. This ice cream. Later, I saw a secondary storage unit filled with beverages. Not water, soda. Bottles of Coca-Cola, neatly arranged in wooden crates, each stamped with 4-troop morale use, Western Front. There were separate bottles for officers, marked with a red stripe. The depot even had a syrup division to mix flavors on demand. Coca-Cola had a military supply branch. That wasn't propaganda. That was doctrine. In Germany, we rationed soap. Here, they distributed soda with priority tags. I stood near the edge of the dock as they loaded pallets onto trucks. One of the drivers offered me a drink from a cooler. It was cold, perfectly cold. I took it in my hands, staring at the condensation forming on the glass. The label read, "Bottled in Georgia, delivered the 9th of October, destination, Belgium." I didn't drink it. Not out of pride, but because I was afraid I'd cry. Not from emotion, but from recognition. Recognition of something I'd never seen before. An army that never let its men feel forgotten. Even in the smallest indulgences, cold milk, sweet syrup, fresh bread, they had built a supply system that whispered, "You matter." That is what killed me inside. Not their tanks, not their bombers, but the quiet hum of refrigeration. That night, I walked alone past the outer edge of the depot, where the refrigeration generators hummed like distant artillery. The air smelled faintly of ammonia and machine oil. I stood under a floodlight and looked back at the rows of warehouses, the moving cranes, the conveyor belts, the armed silence of a system that didn't need heroism because it had design. And for the first time in the war, I realized something brutal. We weren't fighting an army. We were fighting an economy. In Berlin, we had dreams, blueprints, doctrines, propaganda reels that showed endless columns of tanks rolling eastward, infantry marching to Wagner, factories spitting fire and steel. We had maps with arrows and radio speeches that echoed with certainty. But none of that could hide the truth I now saw in full fluorescent clarity. We had no system, only improvisation masquerading as resolve. Weeks passed inside the American depot, but I stopped noticing the days. The calendar meant nothing anymore. What mattered now was pattern, repetition, predictability. Every shipment arrived on time. Every item matched its manifest. Every shelf, no matter how remote, was always restocked before it emptied. And no one celebrated this. No one called it heroism. It was just how it worked. One afternoon, I helped move crates of blood plasma into a temperature-controlled medical bay. Each container was wrapped in shock-resistant foam, tagged by blood type, and labeled with estimated delivery window, plus 3 days to Forward Hospital, France. I touched the label, and my hand froze not from the cold, but from memory. Winter 1942. Near Smolensk. One of our pilots had survived a crash, badly burned. He needed blood. The field medic had 1 vial, left from 2 weeks prior. It had clotted. They tried anyway. He died screaming. Here, in a warehouse 5,000 miles from the front, I now held enough blood to save every man in that squadron. Twice. We hadn't lost the war in the air. We had lost it on paper, in warehouses, in the silence of miscalculation. At night, I began walking the perimeter of the compound alone, past the maintenance yards, past the electrical substations that powered the refrigeration, past the rail sidings that never slept. Trains came and went without pause, one carrying only repair parts for trucks, another with nothing but folding tables. Another, I later learned, was delivering mail. Letters. The Americans flew in letters weekly to frontline soldiers, thousands of them, written, sorted, routed by logistics units dedicated solely to morale delivery. Do you understand what that means? They didn't just feed and clothe their men. They kept their hearts alive. In my country, we told our soldiers that love was weakness. That sentiment was distraction. We told them steel was enough. That sacrifice alone could hold the line. But the Americans? They weaponized comfort. That was their true doctrine. They planned for fatigue, for homesickness, for broken boots, broken radios, broken minds, and they didn't hope things would arrive. They ensured it. With redundancy layered over redundancy, so thick that no single failure could ever ripple beyond its zone. I once read Clausewitz cover to cover, but Clausewitz never walked through an American quartermaster depot. He never saw soldiers issued extra gloves, not because they'd ask, but because weather data predicted a cold snap. He never saw military trucks scheduled like postal routes, running night and day, regardless of weather, morale, or bombing. We thought war was won by courage. But courage dies when the last blanket does. I remember the moment I broke. Truly broke. It wasn't in the warehouses. It wasn't during inventory. It wasn't even when I saw chocolate bars labeled troop only, not for sale. Number. It was when I saw a crate labeled books, fiction, soldier rotation, use by March. Books. For soldiers, rotating front units were sent novels to read during downtime, to preserve not just their bodies, but their sanity. And suddenly I saw it all for what it was. The American war machine wasn't just a supply chain. It was a psychological ecosystem, designed not to endure war, but to dominate it from behind the front lines. When we marched into Poland, we thought we were unstoppable. Blitzkrieg gave us arrogance. The Luftwaffe gave us speed. The SS gave us fear. But America? America gave its men foot powder. And in the end, foot powder beat fanaticism. Years later, I returned to Germany. Not to the Reich, it no longer existed, but to a country cut in half, grayed by memory and silence. I found work as a railway clerk in Hamburg. It suited me. Quiet, procedural, full of timetables and routes that never lied. But the war never left. It stayed in the hum of train engines, in the smell of diesel, in the weight of numbers on paper, and in the silence between questions no one dared to ask. In 1952, I received a letter unsigned, but familiar. A man I once knew, an SS logistics officer. We had crossed paths during the early years France, perhaps, or outside Warsaw. He wrote simply, "Come to Berlin. I need to show you something." Curiosity pulled me there. We met in a quiet cafe near the Tiergarten. The city still bore scars, craters filled with weeds, buildings like broken teeth. He looked older, thinner, but the eyes hadn't changed. Steel blue, analytical, ruthless, once. He carried a leather satchel. From it, he pulled out a folded map. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. I recognized it immediately. The old Harris Group West Logistics Plan 1943. Supply routes drawn in red. Ammunition depots marked with dots. Ration corridors. Medical tents. It had once been our Bible. He slid it across the table. Then, from his satchel, he pulled another map. American. Laminated. Color-coded. It wasn't a plan. It was a system. Arrows showed fuel movement, synchronized with troop shifts. Icons marked ice supply, mail service, laundry rotation, even chaplain service zones. I stared in silence. He lit a cigarette. "I've spent the last 4 years trying to understand what we missed," he said. "We had the better tanks, the better training, the will. What did they have?" He tapped the American map. "They had this." I nodded slowly. "I saw it," I said. "Up close, in Missouri. I worked in their depot for 5 months. I saw the socks, the milk, the books." He blinked. "Books?" I nodded. "For rotating units, soldiers on leave, fiction, labeled, tracked, delivered with their mail." He exhaled, then leaned back. "They built a world where the war was predictable," he said, "where hunger wasn't random, where no one froze waiting for boots." I looked down. "We froze men to death," I whispered, "waiting for boots." He said nothing. Outside, a tram passed by, bells ringing. Then he spoke again. "You remember the battle for Arnhem?" I nodded. "We lost more men to broken bridges and missing fuel than to bullets," he said. "I used to think that was bad luck. Now I know it was bad math." I said nothing. He slid one last paper across the table. It was a casualty report from early 1945 our units near the Oder. Line after line of names. Cause of death. Time of death. Next to many, KIA, exposure. Some KIA, malnutrition. One simply read, found frozen, boots, missing. He tapped the paper. "No American soldier died of missing boots," he said. He stood, collected his maps, and left without another word. I sat there for a long time, staring at both maps. The one we drew, and the one we never even imagined. Years later, in 1985, I visited the 8th Air Force Museum in Georgia. I wasn't invited. I came alone, quiet, civilian clothes. There, among the exhibits of bombers in uniforms, I found something I wasn't expecting. A small plaque, modest, almost hidden. "To the mathematician who saw the unseen, Abraham Wald." Beside it stood a B-negative 17 grams. Painted, restored. On its fuselage, markings indicated reinforced cockpit glass, armored engine cowlings, and protected cable runs. The exact modifications Wald had calculated. A docent stood nearby, explaining to schoolchildren. "He figured out where to put the armor," she said. "Not by looking at where planes got hit, but where the missing ones probably did." I stepped closer, touched the cold aluminum of the engine casing, and I remembered. The crate of books, the ice cream, the belts sorted by humidity. The letters delivered to the front, the powdered foot bath, the men who never missed breakfast. I realized then what we had never understood. America didn't win by chance, or by luck, or even by sheer numbers. They won because they planned for everything, because they believed every man mattered, because they treated supply not as an afterthought, but as the first weapon in every battle. They armored their bombers where no holes were seen. They protected lives before they were in danger. They mapped a war we never saw coming. And in that, they didn't just defeat us. They outthought us, outplanned us, outlasted us.